Do you have a paranormal encounter you'd like to share with us? Send us an email with your story for a chance of it being featured on Weird World. Captain Charles Bradford had never believed in ghosts and was not nervous or imaginative, but had often heard the skull scream. Whatever it was, it hated him almost as much as it hated Dr. Luke Pratt, and it screamed at him. Bradford had always blamed himself for Mrs. Pratt's death, although he had never wished her anything but long life and happiness. If he had not told that story, she might be alive yet, and that was why the thing screamed at him, he fancied. She had been a good, sweet-tempered woman with a gentle voice, but he remembered hearing her shriek once when she thought her little boy had been injured by a pistol that went off accidentally. It was the same scream, exactly the same, with a sort of rising quaver at the end, unmistakable. Bradford had not realised that she and her doctor husband were not on good terms. They sometimes bickered, and she would get red and bite her lip, while Luke, Bradford's cousin, grew pale and said the most offensive things. After Luke's boy Charlie was killed in South Africa, there were no relations left, which is how Bradford had come to now live in their house. He remembered the November night he had made the mistake, when, dining with the Pratts, he had told them the story that afterwards had made so much difference. It was a stormy night in 1892, and the dinner had been so bad and cold that poor Mrs. Pratt had insisted on making a Welsh rarebit to counteract it. Pratt must have had a hard day, perhaps lost a patient, and was out of temper, accusing his wife of trying to poison him. Bradford saw that she was hurt and light-heartedly told them of a serial widow who 50 or 60 years ago had siphoned molten lead into her husband's ears while they slept. Poor Mrs. Pratt died suddenly in her bed not long after. Bradford came to see Luke now and then, who was looking worn and nervous, and some years later, after his son was killed in South Africa, became strange. He grew thinner and thinner till his head looked like a skull with parchment stretched over it, and his eyes had a disagreeable glare in them. He had an old dog called Bumble that Mrs. Pratt had been fond of, who had followed her everywhere. Now, every night, Luke and Bumble would sit looking steadily at each other until Bumble would shake all over, set up an awful howl, then hide under the sideboard where he lay making odd noises. One Christmas, when Bradford's ship was in dock, he came to see Pratt and noticed that Bumble was not there. Luke coldly stated that he had humanely euthanized the dog, as he could stand it no longer. The way he had sat in Mrs. Pratt's chair, glared at him and howled. Bradford had since come to understand what Luke could no longer stand, be it a phenomenon, a voice from outside. There was no proof that Luke had dispatched his wife, nothing but the coincidence that she had died suddenly in her bed a few days after Bradford had told stories to them at dinner. Luke had called over the doctor in the next parish, and they agreed that she had died of something the matter with her heart, a common enough occurrence. Although Bradford had been startled when he found, in the cupboard in the bedroom, a little tinned iron ladle that had not been in the fire more than once or twice. There was some lead in it which had been melted and stuck to the bottom of the bowl, all grey and hardened. That proved nothing, but it gave him an eerie sensation because it looked so much like the thing he had described when he told them the story. He had thrown it into the sea. Luke had been found deceased on the beach one morning, and there was a coroner's inquest. There were marks on his throat, but he had not been robbed, and the verdict was that he had come to his end by the hands or teeth of some person or animal unknown. An old cardboard bandbox that had belonged to his wife lay under his hand, the lid having fallen off. He seemed to have been carrying home a skull in the box. Doctors are fond of collecting such things. It was a small, beautifully shaped skull, very white and with perfect teeth, although it lacked a lower jaw. The locals put it back into the bandbox and on the shelf in the best bedroom of the house, and showed it to Bradford when he took possession. They could not explain why the skull had rolled up the sloping sand and settled at Luke's head instead of down the steep beach. It was turned with the face towards him, almost touching his head. Something else made Bradford feel downright uncomfortable. It occurred to him one evening that the skull might possibly be Mrs. Pratt's. While there was no doubt she had had a proper burial and now lay in the churchyard, and in the face of reason, common sense and probability, he was convinced that Luke had kept her skull in case an examination one day betrayed him. Small lumps of lead had later been found in all 3 skulls of the unfortunate husbands he had spoken to them of. Bradford had until now slept in the best bedroom of the house where Luke's monstrous acts had taken place. The skull obviously wanted to stay where it was, in the bandbox on the shelf in the best bedroom. When it was there, it only screamed now and then, but if he put it out of the house, it went on all night, scaring off the servants. All in the village knew of the curse, making selling or even letting the place out of the question, while local elders predicted a bad end for himself if he stayed on. The skull did rattle when shaken, but Bradford dared not open it. He did not want to know the fact, for if the object was a lump of lead, it would be as if he had done the deed himself. He found he could not sleep in the best bedroom after 3:15 a.m. Was that the time she had passed? Although he could sleep on a ship in a gale, the start, moan, and hard breathing of the presence awoke him immediately. He cautioned guests not to mention what one called his confounded bugbear. Any slight would result in an unearthly shriek. He was sure that the departed woman heard and was hurt by the name-calling, while he also refused to acknowledge her as a ghost. You cannot pick up and rattle a ghost in broad daylight. The voice seemed to grow louder and even got inside his deaf ear, so that one night he got up, grabbed the bandbox and threw it as far out of the window as he could. Then his hair stood on end as the thing screamed in the air like a missile shell, and from the other side of the road continued to shriek all night. He sat up, trying unsuccessfully to read a book. Then, a little before dawn, someone knocked at the front door. A human knock was almost a relief, then followed by another. Bradford called out, asking who was there, but nobody answered, though the knock was repeated. He sang out again and said that the doctor did not live there any longer. There was no answer, so, thinking that it may be some deaf old countryman, Bradford went downstairs and drew the bolt, again hearing the knocking, which was not loud and had a strange, hollow sound. There was nobody there, but as he opened the door inward, something rolled across the threshold and stopped against his foot. He drew back, for he knew what it was, before he looked down. He had thrown the skull in the bandbox right across the road, yet now it lay, turning one hollow eye up at his face, as if it meant to accuse him. He picked the thing up carefully and put it on the table beside the candle. The thing had come home, and it wanted to go upstairs, back to its cupboard. When dawn came, Bradford found the bandbox by the gate near the high road, hanging from a hedge. He took the box upstairs to the cupboard, put the skull back inside and locked it up. At breakfast, the maid resigned, wanting to know if he meant to stay in a haunted house and how long he expected to live. She did not believe that even with his deaf ear, Bradford could sleep through those screams again. He moved his bedroom downstairs that day and found another housekeeper whose husband, the church sexton Mr. Traherne, also took on his gardening. Sometimes Bradford's visitors asked to see the skull, to which he had no objection, as he considered it the most perfect he had seen, except that there were 2 front teeth missing from the lower jaw. He would explain that Traherne had been digging in the garden when he found the jawbone of the skull in a mass of white lime. He thought he must have knocked out the 2 front teeth when breaking up the lime, although he could not see them anywhere. Traherne quietly suggested to Bradford that the jaw may fit the skull, and also said that there was human hair sticking in the lime. The jaw did fit the skull, and Bradford wondered if Traherne knew more than he cared to tell. He would have helped to bury both Mrs. Pratt and her husband in the churchyard. As Bradford fitted the skull with the jaw, its teeth closed sharply on his finger like a hard bite, and he realised that he had been pressing the jaw and skull together with his other hand. It made him think of the strange verdict of the coroner's jury on Luke's death, by the hand or teeth of some person or animal unknown. He wished he had seen those marks on Luke's throat, although the lower jaw was missing then. One evening, Bradford was entertaining an old school friend who asked to see the skull. Despite problems with candles refusing to light, windows bursting open, and the scream of wind throughout the house, he finally retrieved the bandbox from upstairs. To his horror, it was empty. The skull was gone. He was positively certain that he had put a wax seal on the box lid the previous spring. He wondered if Traherne had taken it while he himself was outside gardening, turning the box upside down to be sure. Something fell out and made a little thud on the hearthrug. Lead. So it was lead after all, and Luke did it. Bradford was badly shaken up, and now certain that he himself had caused the end of the poor woman. It was his fault because he had told the story. She was dead before she could scream, but now the screaming around the house was awful, had never been so bad. Perhaps the well-meaning Traherne had buried the skull in consecrated ground, but it needed to be back in the bandbox where it wanted to be. Sure enough, there was a hollow-sounding knock at the door. The skull wanted to come in and be taken upstairs in its box. Despite a now brewing hurricane outside, Bradford and his guest managed to catch the skull as it blew across the floor, but the guest threw it roughly into the bandbox, saying that he had been bitten. Bradford quickly resealed the box with wax and string, then again placed it in the cupboard upstairs, which he then again locked. It was soon after that the mysterious death of retired sea captain Charles Bradford was reported in the local press. Traherne, who had never taken the skull, was one of the few to know that the unexplained circumstances of his passing were horribly similar to that of his cousin Luke, by the hands or teeth of some unknown person. All that could be ascertained was that the perpetrator of the deed was a woman who had evidently lost the 2 lower middle incisors.